So in this paper, we propose a method to convert an image into a sketch with different levels of abstraction.
Welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. We host early career academics and PhD students to share their cutting-edge research in computer vision, machine learning, and everything in between. I'm your host, Itzik Ben Shabbat, a researcher by day and podcaster by night. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to Talking Papers, the podcast where we talk about papers and let the papers do the talking. Today, we will be talking about the paper CLIPasso, Semantically-Aware Object Sketching, which received the Best Paper Award in SIGGRAPH 2022. I'm happy to host the first author of the paper, Yael Vinker. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So thanks for inviting me. My name is Yael Vinker. I'm a PhD student at Tel Aviv University under the supervision of Professor Daniel Cohen-Or and Professor Arik Shamir. And in my research, I combine between arts, design, and machine learning. So I'm interested in computer graphics, but from the side of art. I am an amateur artist in myself. Like I love to draw and sculpt.
Wow, yeah, great. Combining these fields is always really interesting.
Thanks.
And who are the co-authors of this paper?
So this paper was started actually as a summer internship at EPFL University in Switzerland. I started it there and then I came back to Israel and started my PhD. So there are 8 authors on this paper. Some are students from EPFL and some are students, the supervisors from Israel. So I hope I remember everyone, but so it's me, Esan, which was very, very helpful. Jessica, Roman, Amit Bermano, Daniel Cohen-Or, and Amir Zamir, which is the head of the lab in EPFL, and Arik Shamir.
Excellent. Wow. Long list. Okay. Such a good paper requires a lot of people. All right. So in a TLDR kind of format, in 2 or 3 sentences, what is this paper about?
So actually, the core idea of this paper is about abstractions, and we express abstractions through sketches. So this paper is about how can you extract the essence of a given visual concept given as an image and express your understanding of the input through the sketch. This understanding is emerged when the constraint is to sketch the image with different levels of abstraction.
So this sounds super interesting. So you get an image as input and you want to create a sketch from it with different levels of abstraction, right? But before we dive into the method, let's first talk a little bit about related work. So before coming to read this paper, which 1 or 2 other papers would you recommend people to read?
For the relevant background to understand what we do. So first, of course, the title is CLIPasso. Our method is based on a model named CLIP, which is a language vision model trained and developed in OpenAI. And basically, this model was originally trained for a different task of learning a shared latent space between text and images. And this model was trained on a huge data set of 400 million pairs of text and image. And therefore, it has seen so many concepts and so many images, including sketches and cartoons and whatever you can think of if you try to imagine how 400 million images look like. And we rely on this very strong prior in order to extract meaningful features from both a sketch and an image without any need to train some model for this task specifically. So it's called zero-shot tasks. So this is one component that is very important for our model. And another component that without it, we couldn't do our work. It's something that's called a differentiable renderer. The work called specifically diffvg. And differentiable renderer allows you to take vector representation of strokes. Our sketches are composed of strokes. And do something that's called rasterization, which is transferring a vector representation into pixels. And then because the CLIP models and other models we know they know how to operate in the pixel domain. They have no idea what strokes are. So in order to extract some features or whatever you need, the input must be an image, which is composed of pixels. So a differentiable rasterizer, it would allow this process of taking strokes, transfer them to pixels, compute some loss function, and then backpropagate the loss through the differentiable renderer to change the parameters of the strokes.
Right. So definitely two very relevant recent works, right? The CLIP model, which everything's kind of based on. And I really like the twist that you don't really need the image and sketch pairs in this case, right? You just use the CLIP representation to kind of circumvent that. And the differentiable renderer. Definitely go read those papers. I will make sure to put a link in the description. Okay, now let's dive into the introduction of the paper. So what problem is this paper addressing?
In this paper, we try to tackle a known task of image to sketch translation from a different perspective. So the idea came from my knowledge in arts and design. And when I read papers about generally style transfer and specifically image to sketch, I find it very hard to accept that this mapping is usually treated as one-to-one mapping. However, as a person that used to sketch, you never get one single sketch. There are always many, many, many options to sketch the same input, and all the sketches you create are correct. It's not like that there is one ground truth. So then the motivation is that this is not one-to-one test. This is a one-to-many test, because there are many, many ways and different styles and different levels of abstractions to convey a given input through a sketch. So this is the core motivation. And then our main observation is that we want to focus on abstraction because there is also the option to focus on style, and there are many other approaches. However, we decided to focus on abstraction.
Let me just stop you there for a second. So I kind of want to recap what you just said, right? So the input to your method is an image, right? An RGB regular image, and the output is a sketch, right? So a sketch is basically white background and then brush strokes, right? Lines. Okay.
Exactly.
And when you say abstractions, you mean kind of how do I decompose the different shapes into different brush strokes, right? So if I go back to some of my artistic training, right, you sometimes learn to kind of block out stuff, right? Do like simple shapes like circles and rectangles and stuff like that to kind of get an abstract shape, and then you kind of find lines that kind of connect and convey the semantic meaning. So this is what you mean by levels of abstraction, right? It can be like a single line, just the silhouette, or more detailed lines, and etc.
So abstraction is not a very well-defined term. You can define it the way you said. I can define it differently. In the paper, we choose to define the abstraction image with the number of strokes the method uses. However, in other papers, for example, abstraction emerged with time limit. If I give you 5 seconds to draw something, or if I give you 1 hour to draw something, probably the 5 seconds will emerge more abstractions. So it depends. But it's important to understand the motivation that if, for example, I give you the task to draw your cat or something, so probably perhaps you will draw some features of a cat, like the whiskers and the ears of the cat. And perhaps I will draw some more realistic cat, because people draw with different levels of abstraction. And this is what we want to express in this paper. So this is, so far is the motivation. And going into more technical details, so indeed the input to our method is an image of an object. Our method mostly work on objects and not on scenes, for example. And the output is a set of strokes. Each stroke is a Bezier curve with 4 control points. And the set of strokes should depict the input image of the object. And then you can modify the number of strokes to get different levels of abstraction.
Right. So why is this an important problem? Like, where is this useful, right? When do I use okay, here's an image, give me a sketch.
Okay, so there are two aspects for this question. So first, from the practical aspect, this task is useful because it's first, it's creative. Also, as a designer or as a creator, people can really use this tool really to create art. And indeed, when this method came out, people were very excited about it and tried it by their own. And it's really fun to feel like you creating something new with the help of the computer. So it's for creativity and really for practical purposes, that if you want to create an art piece with some computer graphic programs, so it can do the job for you. And additionally, this task of sketches are really core to design. It's something that designers and artists do a lot to take an input. It can be an input image, or it can be something that you see and you want to draw. It's something that you do all the time. So it's important for computer graphic researchers to develop tools that can help designers and graphic artists to do what they do in their daily life. So it's very useful, and sketches are a very useful domain. So this is one thing.
Right. And sketches is like another tool in the artist toolbox, and what you're basically giving them is like this AI-powered sketcher. So give me an image, I'll give you a sketch, and then take the sketch and continue to work off that.
Exactly.
But what are the main challenges then in this kind of problem? So
yeah, it's a good question. It really takes me to the second aspect I wanted to say. This task is highly challenging. So think about it. If I give you this task, for example, or even for, not sure what your art skill are, but even for a very skilled artist, if I give you the task of drawing some input image with different levels of abstraction, it's not very trivial to accomplish. If I give you only 4 strokes and tell you to draw a certain, I don't know, your cat or your dog, if you think about it, it's very hard to do it. Especially, it's hard to do it in a visually pleasing way, that it looks nice. So also in the paper, we give the motivation of a very famous series by Picasso. And from that, we also were inspired for the name of the paper, CLIPasso. So we show in the paper Picasso's famous series of a bull, where Picasso simplifies a bull and tries to really express the bull with different levels of abstraction. And besides being very aesthetic and famous, you can see that this is a very challenging task. You should make some choices here of which features you want to emphasize and which features you want to remove. And it's highly non-trivial. And this is also why this task is useful, because from a research perspective, it's very interesting to see the abilities of machine learning or AI to extract the essence of an object and express it through sketches. So it's interesting also from a philosophical aspect.
Okay, but back to the challenges. So let's talk about a little bit the technical challenges. You mentioned this in the related work. So what were the main challenges that you faced when working on this paper?
We have basically we had 2 main challenges. So the first challenge was when using Clip, because Clip was trained to fit pairs of images and text. And we use Clip in order to fit, you can think of it as fitting pairs of image and image, where we have our input image and we have the image of the sketch. So if we use the regular way of using Clip is using its final embeddings, which are trained for text. And then therefore, if you use the final embeddings of Clip, they are highly semantic in nature. So when you use it, you will get a sketch that expresses the semantic features of the input image, but perhaps the sketch will miss the structure of the input image. And in order to preserve the identity of the object, the structure is really important, because we want to draw, for example, a specific cat and not just some cat.
So if I would reformulate that challenge, I would say it's the challenge is to to create this fusion between the semantic meaning and the structure of a given image, right? So it's a cat. It's not just any cat. It's this specific cat. And this is something that Clip, right, it would have a hard time capturing, right? Because it would only give you the text of that cat.
Exactly. It gives you basically embeddings that correspond to text, and therefore it's not very specific.
Right. Any other challenges?
Sure. So there were many challenges. The goal of this project was to really understand how machines or machine learning models, how they see sketches. Because if you think about it, we as people, if I give you a sketch of a cat, you can immediately say that it's a cat, but it's not an image of a cat. And also, I don't know, 3 years old kid could also see this sketch of a cat and say that it's a cat, even though the kid perhaps haven't seen so many sketches of a cat. So the main question was, why can we as people understand that so easily? And can machine learning models do that as well? And then the challenge was, which model should we use? We didn't want to train any model on sketches and images because we wanted really to see if these models can somehow understand by their own without being trained for this task, because a kid is not trained for the task of identifying sketches as their classes. They just know that somehow. So this was the challenge. How can we do that? And then we really find that Clip is a great fit, because Clip, even though it was not trained for the task of feeding sketches and images, it can do that quite well because of the strong visual prior it has.
Yeah, it's an interesting take on this, right? Kids don't see a lot of sketches and a lot of images of cats, and they say, "Oh, now that's a sketch of a cat," because I know I've seen enough of those, right? They see a cat, they see maybe one sketch or two, and then they know how to make that connection. And that's one of the things I liked about the paper, that how you kind of went through the CLIPasso presentation to kind of lead that on, like give the semantic meaning. All right, let's talk a little bit about the contributions of the paper. So what are the main contributions here?
I think first is the idea of even discussing abstractions. It's not super mainstream. I don't see many papers about abstractions. And as I said, specifically in sketches, there are only 2 previous sketch papers that try to produce sketches with different levels of abstraction. So I think the main contribution here in terms of idea is to bring the abstraction concept or even this task forward maybe to the mainstream of works, that because people don't even think about it. So this is one thing. Another thing is using Clip to measure distance between images, because as I mentioned, Clip is usually used, it makes sense because it was trained for that, as a distance metric between text and images. But it wasn't used before to measure the distance between pairs of images. And specifically, we also propose to use the intermediate activations of Clip to measure distance between the image of the sketch and our input image. Something like perceptual loss or LPIPs, which was it was used on models trained on images for classification. And we really identified that the intermediate activations of Clip, of the image encoder of Clip, has a very great knowledge about abstractions and about semantics, much more than something like LPIPs, which we compare to. And another technical contribution here is the initialization. So our method is optimization based. We don't train any network. We just optimize the strokes parameters directly. And therefore, the method is really sensitive to initialization as any direct optimization approach. And we propose to initialize the strokes based on salient regions of the input object. And this really helped to converge.
Right. So just salient regions, that means areas in the image that are more appealing to people eye gaze would attract to them. These are unique regions, right? There are multiple definitions of saliency.
So sure, saliency here is meant as we took it from explainability method. It's like if, for example, you have an image of a cat and you know it's a cat, but why? What makes it a cat? So maybe what are the important components? So the important components are, for example, I don't know, the nose, the ears. So you want to start from there. Otherwise, you start randomly on the canvas, you might miss the ears or something, and you don't want to miss it. You want to draw the ears for sure.
All right, so let's dive into the approach. So tell us, what did you do and how did you do it?
The approach is basically, it's pretty simple. So we define a sketch as a set of strokes. The strokes are curves. Specifically, we chose Bezier curves with 4 control points, but this is a parameter that you can change. And we start with a set of strokes initialized based on the salient regions of the input object. And then we want to optimize the strokes to fit the input object. And we do that with the guidance of CLIP. So our process is iterative. At each iteration, we feed the parameters of the strokes into a differentiable rasterizer. The job of the differentiable rasterizer is to transfer a set of parameters of strokes, which is just, think about it as a tensor of xy, xy, xy. It's not an image. And you want to take this set of points and translate it into a rasterized image. Raster means pixels. You just want a set of pixels. In each pixel, you want to have a notion if there is a stroke there or not. So you take this set of points, you transfer it into pixels, you have the initialized sketch. And then at the beginning, imagine this sketch is initialized randomly, so it just looked like random strokes on a white canvas. And you want these strokes to better fit the input image. So what we do, you take the sketch and you take the image, you feed them through a pre-trained CLIP model, and you compute the loss between the two. And I will explain about the loss in a minute. And then once you have this loss, this distance between the two, since our entire forward process was differentiable, we can just backpropagate the gradients through the frozen CLIP model and the frozen differentiable render and update the strokes parameters. And then at each step, our parameters taking a small step towards the final sketch, and they really converge to a sketch that depicts the input image. And that's it, basically.
Right. Okay. Let me recap. Let me see that I understand the concept. You take an image, you then compute the saliency map, right? You use that saliency map to initialize strokes. And when I say strokes, that means Bezier curves, so control points and maybe other parameters. But if I'm not mistaken, you didn't do that. So you showed examples of like the stroke width and stuff like that. But for this case, just the points, right?
Exactly.
These points are actually the parameters that you're optimizing for, right? This is what you want to change. You want to change these control points. So you change the strokes to fit the image, right? Okay.
Exactly.
So you have the image, you got the saliency, you got the points. Now you take the points, you feed them through a differentiable rasterizer. Now you have a sketch image. You feed the sketch image into a clip, you feed the RGB image into the clip, you get 2 representations, and you want to push them to be close somehow. We haven't talked about the losses yet. And then you backprop everything to change the points, and you do that again and again and again until you get the strokes just right.
Perfect.
Okay, so let's talk about the losses. How do you measure what's what? Like, how do you measure similarity between these things?
Okay, cool. So our loss function is composed of 2 terms. We named them L semantic and L geometric. So L semantic is the common way of using CLIP as a distance metric. So it's just the cosine distance between the CLIP embeddings of the input image and the input sketch. And then, as I mentioned before, L semantic, as the name suggests, is basically semantic in nature. So it's not enough to model the input image, its structure. It's basically responsible on modeling the semantics of the image. So therefore, what we propose is to use another loss term, L-geometric, which is responsible for preserving the geometric. And in this loss, we compare the L2, we compute the L2 distance between the intermediate activations of a clip on the input sketch and on the input image.
Right. So if I try to interpret the meaning of these two losses, right? One of them is the semantic one, right? It would give you if you give it an image of a cat, it will give you a cat, but it doesn't matter where the cat is with respect to the image. And the geometric one would say, no, the face of the cat should be here, the body of the cat should be there. Try to keep it as close as possible, and you do that through the intermediate layer activations of the clip model.
Exactly.
All right. Wow. Super interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe just to mention, right? So during the optimization, you said you were optimizing for the Bezier curve points, right? But you could have optimized for other parameters that define the strokes. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So there are many parameters, for example, color, width, that you can also modify. However, we set all parameters that are not position. First, because our sketches, we want them to be simple. It's part of the point. As they are more simple, it should be more difficult for the model. And therefore, we really want to express the essence of the input object through this simplicity. But it's also definitely possible to add to also optimize these parameters. You can optimize the width if you want. And you can also, if you want colors, you can also do that.
Wow. Okay. So future work section probably. Okay, but let's now talk about the results, right? So this is a very interesting method, and I guess figuring out which experiments to do to evaluate how well this works wasn't trivial. So what experiments did you do, and how did you evaluate the performance?
We conducted a perceptual study, in which is defined as follow. Initially, we defined as we kind of invented the task, we also defined the objectives that we want to fulfill. So our goal was to first produce sketches at different levels of abstraction. And we want the sketches to preserve also the structure and the geometry of the input object, but also to convey the semantics of the input object. So it's not an edge map. For example, an edge map is something that is the most geometric sketch you can achieve, but it's not necessarily semantic. And let's say something like a doodle, like quick draw, if you know it, but something like a doodle is the most semantic thing you can get, but it has nothing to do with structure. Just to say, no, the doodle is something. If I tell you draw a cat, so you draw some cat, but of course it has no grounding in any structure because you haven't seen any input image. So our goal is to produce sketches that preserve semantic and geometric. So we defined a user study for that with two questions. So to measure to what extent we preserve the semantics, we first we created the sketches for a certain set of images with 4 levels of abstraction, using 4, 8, 16, and 32 strokes. Then to evaluate the level of semantic preservation, we showed people the sketches and we showed them some classes, and we asked the participant to choose which class this sketch represents. So for example, you see a sketch of, a cat with 4 strokes, and you need to say if it's a cat or dog or an elephant or whatever. So this is one task. And the second task, in order to evaluate the structure preservation, so we also show participants the sketches, but now instead of textual classes, we showed them images from the same class. So for example, you see a sketch of a cat and you see 4 images of cats, and you need to choose which specific cat is this. And then this kind of measures if we preserve the geometry or not. And we really saw an interesting pattern that, for example, when using only 4 strokes, the semantics is not preserved enough. So if we use only 4 strokes, often you wouldn't recognize the class. But however, because of our geometric term, you can often say which specific cat it is because it can follow the geometry, the contour of the cat, even though you don't even see it's a cat. So it was a very interesting perceptual study.
Yeah, really interesting, like how humans interpret these kind of things. So it's really interesting to kind of dive into the brain of people and see how these optimization-based approaches can actually do stuff that are meaningful. So did you have does the method have any specific fail cases?
Sure, like any method. So, okay, we have a few limitations here. Specifically, if we concentrate on the task of object sketching, etc. So, because we rely on Clip, even though Clip is very has a wide knowledge about visual concept, still, of course, it has some limitations. So we even show in the paper that on a very simple example, like CFAR numbers. So you can, if for example, we show on the number 3. So it's hard to our method to capture that it's 3. It just try to follow the contours, and it's also something that the authors of the original Clip paper showed that because these kinds of images, you don't see them a lot in Google, for example. They are not very common. So also Clip model struggles with capturing these because it's highly non-natural image. So even something so simple, if I give you like an image of the number 3 and I tell you to draw it with 1 stroke, of course it's easy. But for our method, it's not that easy. So it's very interesting. This is one limitation.
Right. Because it's based on the Clip model. So it's basically one of the limitations is joint limitations with Clip. So it kind of biased towards the data that Clip was trained on.
Exactly. Yeah. And another limitation of our method is that the way we emerge abstraction, the way abstractions are happen here is with a predefined number of strokes. So, for example, in the paper, we show very nice examples of sketches that were drawn using only 4 strokes. However, for different images, maybe often 4 strokes may not work. So the problem is that to achieve a certain level of abstraction, some images may need different number of strokes. So, for example, if I want to draw, I don't know, like
a ball.
Yeah, a ball.
So a ball, 4 strokes would be enough, right? And an elephant, you need probably more than 4.
You probably need more. But visually, for people, if you ask them, are these 2 sketches from the same level of abstraction? It might be, regardless of the number of strokes used. So number of strokes is not the best way to emerge abstraction, and perhaps better ways can be developed in the future.
Yeah, actually, I have maybe it's a random question, but why 4 control points, right? That's also another one of the kind of those choices that you make. But if you take more control points, then every stroke can be more descriptive, right? You can create more complex geometry. So was there any reason for choosing 4, or is it just
True.
the best one?
So actually, there are many parameters here. Since we rely on the DCG, the differentiable rasterizer, so we are limited to whatever the library can offer. Basically, there is an option in its current implementation. It cannot offer Bezier curve or splines with more than 4 control points. However, you can connect few splines together, with few segments. So it's still 1 stroke basically because it's connected. So at the beginning, indeed, I experimented with longer strokes. However, you always need to get to a point where you say, okay, I choose this and that's it, because there are so many parameters. So we said that just for simplicity, each stroke is 1 stroke and not with few segments. But the method is quite flexible. It's really easy to play with and change.
So were there any kind of surprising or unexpected results that you encountered during the experiments?
to me, everything was a surprise because to me, it was amazing that this can even work that way, that it was not even trained for this task. And you get these really minimalist sketches that are super hard to produce as an artist. Super hard. It's very hard. As minimal as you go, it's harder. And so I was super surprised that this thing can even work without being trained specifically for this task. And I guess that perhaps the robustness was pretty new, at least back then. It was a year ago, which in this era is like, I don't know, 10 years, I don't know, but it's a lot of time. But yeah, back then it was amazing to see how robust it is, because all previous sketch-based approaches were limited to a predefined set of classes. Let's say, I don't know, even if it's 100 classes, if you think about it, it's the common classes you see, like, okay, cat, dog, vase, table, and blah, and blah, and blah. But you cannot really draw something that has some social context. For example, I show in the paper a sketch of Frida Kahlo, which has the eyebrow and some special characteristics. So it's pretty cool. This model Clip knows about Spider-Man and stuff like that. So it's pretty awesome that you're not limited to a certain set of classes. You can draw basically whatever you want.
Yeah, that's a really nice property to have. Okay, conclusion and future work. How do you see the impact of the paper going forward? Or actually, since it's a year ago, so how has the impact been so far?
Okay, good question. So my hoping was to kind of open this field of abstraction and perhaps make the community of style transfer, it is a community, to maybe think beyond the well-familiar tasks and think about new ideas like levels of abstraction. And this concept of abstraction can be used for many domains, not only sketches. You can do multiple levels of abstraction almost for anything that has style in it. So I was really hoping for that to happen. It didn't really happen yet, but I don't know, maybe someday. I think that at least at the moment, the paper, luckily, and I'm very happy for it. It had an impact. People were very enthusiastic about the results, and I think that maybe draw some attention to the field of style transfer to perhaps more minimal representations. And yeah, I don't know. I hope that in the future, more people will be interested in emerging abstractions.
Yeah, I think like the first thing you said is super important. So as a PhD, you have, I think, the most amount of time and the most amount of freedom, well, depending on your supervisor, but kind of to chase up these ideas that can become, like, as you said, like open up this research field. And I think this is like a general good advice for PhD students listening to the podcast. So never, like, it's okay to try and like beat some state of the art and kind of work in like a live and active field, but it's always better to chase up these ideas that have the potential to open up a field and become this kind of a problem of its own that stands on its own. And I think that's probably one of the main reasons this paper got a best paper award, right? It's nothing like you've seen before. It has this very specific and unique take on this task.
Thank you. I really hope that it will inspire people to perhaps, think outside of the box and maybe think about new tasks and basically work on what they find inspiring, because this was my motivation to work on that project, because it's really my cup of tea. I really like specifically sketches and minimalist one. And for me, it was super fun. And I think when you work on something that you like, so eventually, hopefully, it turns out to be successful.
Yeah, definitely. We're getting to my favorite part of the podcast, which is what did reviewer 2 say? So please share some insightful comments that the reviewers had.
I must say that most of the reviewers were excited about the idea, and luckily they understood the connection to neuroscience, and just to think how people draw and take the inspiration from there. And reviewer 2 said that perhaps we need to also compare our sketches to ones of humans. This was the main suggestion that was not existed in the paper. Because in this paper, the original goal was not to compare or to mimic a certain style of a human. It was basically the opposite. We wanted to see what machines can do. But of course, you have to listen to reviewer 2 and do what they say. So eventually, we really conducted a comparison to a data set of human-made sketches. And there is such a data set of sketches with different levels of abstraction from the paper of 2013. And luckily, my supervisor, Arik Shamir, is one of the authors. So we had access to this data and we could run a comparison. So the reviewer asked to compare the variability of sketches of our generated sketches to variability of humans. So because in the paper, each seed basically gives you a bit different sketch. So you can create many sketches with the same number of strokes for a given object. It converges every time to a different solution. So we had to think of this experiment of how to compare the variability of our sketches to those of humans. And of course, the result was that sketches of humans has much higher variability than our sketches, but we had to show it, so we did it. So this was one thing. And the second thing was really showing the limitations, which I think was very important. And we did not include it, at least visually. So we really added these 2 experiments of visually showing where our method fails. And yeah, I think it really helped the paper to, encourage future work and better understand where the limitations came from.
Yeah, I can totally understand where this reviewer 2 came from, right? Because I think the notion of trying to imitate the way people do things is an interesting one. It might have not been the original intent of the paper, but I think it's an interesting one. And I think the additional experiment really kind of shows some aspect of that. And I think there's a lot of value in adding that experiment into the paper. And I think it did make it better. And this is the whole role of the review process, right? To make the paper better and make the science more thorough. So thanks, reviewer 2.
Thank you so much.
Okay, is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to mention?
Yeah, maybe just one additional aspect is that since our method is based on strokes and it's vector representation, which is first most natural to sketches and also is very useful in graphic design. So you can basically take these parameters and also place some style on top of the sketches. And then you can get sketches with different appearance and different style. And also you can kind of mimic human-drawn sketches or your own style. You can just place it on top of the strokes because it's vectorized. So it's another cool thing.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's another level of flexibility that you kind of allow people to do that. Yeah, and a huge great job to you on the demo and all the code being available and allowing people to play with it. I think it's super valuable. I think these are one of those things that you kind of don't have to do when you submit a paper, but it's so awesome when a researcher actually goes and does the effort and publishes all of that kind of stuff. So the community can really see the power and dig into the details. So great job on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that you appreciate it.
All right. So, Yael, thank you very much for being a part of the podcast. And until next time, let your papers do the talking. And now for a word from our sponsor. Are you interested in 3D and AI? If so, the team at UM is interested to hear from you. Yum is an Israeli startup dedicated to volumetric video creation. They were voted as the 2022 Best Startup to Work For by the Duns 100. Join their team that works on geometric deep learning research, implicit representations of 3D humans, NeRFs, and 3D 4D generative models. Visit yum.com. Thank you for listening. That's it for this episode of Talking Papers. Please subscribe to the podcast feed on your favorite podcast app. All links are available in this episode description and on the Talking Papers website. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, sponsor it, or just share your thoughts with us, feel free to email talking.papers.podcast@gmail.com. Be sure to tune in every week for the latest episodes. And until then, let your papers do the talking.